in the process of transforming myself from an enviro-agnostic to an enviro-believer, I left everyone unhappy. The constituency from which I originally came from, the economic growth constituency, considers me to be a traitor, and the environmental community thinks I was not progressive enough during my tenure as minister. So I ended up pleasing actually nobody in the process. But I'm glad that I've had this opportunity of coming here. I was to be here last year, but for some last-minute emergency I could not make it. And I was determined to come here and speak to what must be perhaps the largest concentration of young scientific talent in the area of conservation and natural resource management. And I congratulate Ravi and his colleagues for putting together this academic conclave. The film that you saw is a natural trailer to what I am going to say. I am going to speak to you about the forthcoming Paris conclave, the Paris Conference on Parties, which is scheduled to be held in the last week of November and the first week of December, which many believe will somehow, in some mysterious fashion, begin to solve the problems of climate change, such as we have understood it and felt it. Let me, of course, begin by saying that we are all concerned about climate change. Although there is a large community of climate change skeptics, I think increasingly it has becoming evident across the world that climate change is a reality. But what is, of course, under dispute is the extent to which this climate change is human-induced, induced by economic activity, and how much of it is part of a natural cyclical process. Even on that, I think the scientific evidence is accumulating over the past 10 to 15 years that increasingly human interventions in the area of agriculture, industry, transport, and most importantly in the field of energy is causing a build-up of carbon dioxide, most notably methane and nitrous oxides, much less talked about, but equally potent, perhaps more potent from a global warming point of view, and as well as the build-up of the hydrofluorocarbons, of which I will speak about later, although most of the public attention and scholarly debate is devoted to the build-up of carbon dioxide. The global community 5 years ago met in Copenhagen and gave a global goal that what we must do is to limit the temperature increase in the 21st century to no more than 2 degrees Celsius over the temperature that prevailed around 1850 and thereabouts. So in other words, the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere should not, under the worst of circumstances, should not exceed 450 parts per million. Now, we are at about 390 parts per million, and at the rate at which we are going, the rate at which countries are embarking on their economic growth, it is a fair bet that by the end of the 21st century, we will have a temperature increase of not 2 degrees Celsius, but anywhere between 3.5 to 4 degrees Celsius. So this is the background under which the Paris International Conference with 193 countries is taking place. And this Paris conference is supposed to finally, after 20 years of tortuous and protracted negotiations, come up with an international agreement which would bind countries to actions that would limit global warming, that would limit the buildup of carbon dioxide, most importantly. Now, the reality, of course, is somewhat different. The reality is that as we head to Paris in about 2 months' time, the most expected outcome at Paris is an international agreement that will be politically acceptable, that will be economically desirable, but will not be environmentally optimal. It will not be an environmentalist delight. It would not be in tune with the 2 degrees Celsius trajectory, but it is something that countries would be happy with to begin. And this is because international environmental negotiations are a trade-off of political objectives, economic objectives, and environmental objectives. When you get to negotiate an international agreement, it's not just looking at it from a climate change point of view, but you're also looking at it from a point of view of what it does to economic growth and what it does to political sovereignty. So the international agreement that we are going to get, as I said, will be environmentally suboptimal, but is an agreement that countries will adhere to because they're politically comfortable with it, and that this would be something that would not be detrimental to the economic growth requirements of those countries. Now, most countries have already announced their contributions, what in normal English you and I would call commitments, but which in the language of negotiations, which is an English of its own, it's called INDCs, the intended nationally determined contributions. Long-winded way of saying commitment. You don't want to say commitment, but you want to say intended, so that you are saying that you are doing it on your own. Nationally determined contribution. Contribution is a little more homeopathic than commitment. Commitment gives a sense that you're going to be held accountable for it. So INDC is the basic architecture of the Paris Agreement. Now, those of you who are familiar with the climate change debate will know about the Kyoto Protocol, which bound the industrialized countries to cutting emissions. The Kyoto Protocol was a top-down agreement. Targets for emissions were set for each of the industrialized countries, and these targets were then expected to be met by these countries. Now, over the last 15 to 20 years, we have come to the conclusion, painful no doubt, but realistically, from a political point of view, that top-down commitments don't work in the international political economy. It's only commitments that are taken on by governments as part of their domestic political process, of which they are comfortable with, that will be actually workable. So what you're having now in Paris is a bottom-up, not a top-down, a bottom-up architecture of commitments, or what are called the INDCs. The United States has announced its INDCs. The Chinese have announced their INDCs. The Europeans have announced. The Russians have announced. Many other countries have announced. And not surprisingly and unexpectedly, India is one of the few countries that has not announced. We will announce it at the very last minute after taking into account everything that others have done. And I will have some occasion to talk about what India can realistically offer to the international community in Paris. So this is as far as the commitments are concerned. Remember, the commitments don't add up to 2 degrees Celsius. That's the fundamental point. The commitments of all the countries add up to 3.5 to 4 degrees Celsius at best, could be even 5 degrees Celsius. So we are staring at the prospect of an international agreement that is not going to fulfill the global objective as of now. Hence, what I have been saying, and what I think increasingly we should come to the understanding, that Paris is not a starting point, it's not a destination. Paris is a starting point. It's a springboard for countries to take the transition to a low carbon growth pathway and to be held internationally accountable for it. Now, insofar as this architecture is concerned, it only goes for the commitments. Now, what will be the yardsticks of success at Paris is to what extent the international community can agree to an architecture for the measurement, for the reporting, and for the verification of these commitments. In other words, it would be a hybrid architecture of a bottom-up commitments and a top-down architecture for ensuring verifiability, monitoring, and reporting. Because it is not enough for countries to announce commitments on their own and not be held accountable for it. That's a meaningless proposition. I mean, that means Paris is a complete waste of time. So if Paris is unable to bring together an agreement that has these commitments as taken on by the countries as part of their domestic political process, but countries agree to an international system of verification and monitoring and reporting. Once in 5 years, you review your level of ambition, you review in order to ensure that you take on a higher level of commitment, then it could be said that Paris is on the road to success. Now, this is the broad background that I want to give on Paris before I talk more specifically about the Indian situation. The sum and substance of what I'm saying is, don't look for miracles in Paris. Don't look for the magic wand to emerge out of Paris. It's going to be a long fought struggle. It would set the trajectory for low carbon growth. It would, at best, create an architecture for international monitoring, but it will not meet your global goal of limiting the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere to 400 parts per million. Now, what is India to do in such a situation? What is India's stake in Paris? And what should India be actually doing? Now, the traditional Indian position has been that we didn't cause the problem, so we don't have to be part of the solution. And as always, India's position is informed by morality, by argumentation, by a recourse to ethics, to dharma, to justice, and all these wonderful metaphysical concepts that have really no meaning in actual practice. India accounts for 6% of global emissions. China is at 29%. The United States accounts for about 16%. The EU, the European Union, 28 countries account for about 11%, and India accounts for 6%. In the last 20 years, the contribution of India to global warming, or contribution of India to the emissions, to global emissions, has increased from 3% to 6%. So it's doubled in the last 20 years. And if we continued on the high economic growth path, as we expect we will, and as we hope we will, by the year 2030, India will be the world's second largest emitter. It is today the world's third largest emitter. If you take the EU, it's the fourth largest. But by the year 2030, India would be, in terms of emissions, where the United States is today. So if the United States is high on a declining curve, India is low on an ascending curve. And by 2030, we would be around 15% of world emissions, and the Chinese would probably be accounting for about 22%. In other words, to use the language of economics, India has not contributed to the stock of emissions, but India is the most important contributor in the next 15 years to the flow of emissions. In the last 15 years, it's the Chinese who have contributed the maximum to the flow, and in the next 15 years, it's going to be India. So India is on the world's radar screen. India is under the radar screen not because of its current level of emissions, which is low, but because of its expected growth of emissions over the next 15 years, which will lead it to be number 2 by the year 2030. Now, we have in India, when we are in trouble internationally, when we are under pressure internationally, we have a wonderful concept called per capita. Now, this per capita works to our advantage brilliantly, because there's no other country in the world which has a per capita, which has a denominator of 1.24 billion, which is increasing by 14 million every year. Just think what you can do with per capita indices. So when Indra Nooyi comes to India and meets the Prime Minister, she tells the Economic Times that India is the biggest market for Pepsi because the per capita consumption of soft drinks in India is very low. Per capita consumption of most commodities would be very low, and lo and behold, per capita emissions is also very low, because what you're doing is you're dividing your gigatons of carbon dioxide by 1.24 billion with an increase of 14 million every year. So while the United States has a per capita emissions of 15 tons, China now has a per capita emission of 8 tons. The Europeans have a per capita emission of 8 tons. India has a per capita emission of 2 tons. So when we go for international negotiations, we don't talk about emissions, we talk about per capita emissions, because it is our God-given birthright to pollute the world. So this has been the traditional Indian approach. The traditional Indian approach is that we are an increasing population, we are demographically a rising power. You have no business to tell us to control our population. All you have to do is to open your carbon space for us to actually occupy that carbon space, because that is our right. If you are at 15 tons and if you are at 8, Chinese are at 8 tons and we are at 2 tons, surely justice demands climate justice. In fact, a new word has come called climate justice. Climate justice demands that we go from 2 tons to 8 tons. So per capita emissions has been, and not surprisingly, nobody has bought this argument. We are in a solitary splendor of one, fighting this battle for the last 20 years, that the world should create an international architecture which would somehow equalize per capita emissions at maybe 4 tons or 6 tons or 8 tons, as the case may be, which would then give India a sufficient space for expansion. Now, what I want to argue with you, and what I have been trying to argue with singular lack of success in my own government, unfortunately, and certainly not with this government, is that while India's contribution to emissions may be low, India's vulnerabilities are the maximum. And the reason why India must take global warming seriously is not because of the 6% going to 15% figure, which is important, but because of the index of vulnerabilities is the maximum in India. And let me explain to you what I mean. Some of it you saw in Suresh's wonderful film. Many countries have 1 or 2 dimensions of vulnerability. Bangladesh, Maldives, these are all countries, Solomon Islands, these are all countries vulnerable to increase in mean sea levels. There are some countries like Chile, Peru, Antarctica, Greenland, which are vulnerable to retreat of glaciers. But there is no country in the world which is vulnerable on 4 different dimensions as India is. The first dimension you saw, the monsoon. 70% of our rainfall is a southwest monsoon. 60% of our cultivated area is still rain-fed. And even though agriculture contributes only 15% of GDP, over half of India depends on livelihoods and prosperity on the monsoon. So the monsoon fails, your GDP might not go down dramatically like it used to, but rural employment declines, rural purchasing power declines, rural prosperity declines, and that has multiplier effects down the line. So the uncertainty, let me make it clear, there is no evidence that monsoon will decline on account of climate change as yet. What there is evidence for is the frequency of extreme events will go up. So extreme dry days probability will go up, extreme rainfall days probability will go up. In other words, an uncertainty gets introduced in the monsoon cycle. Not many countries in the world are dependent on the rainfall for agriculture as India is. In fact, there is no country in the world that is dependent on the rainfall as India is for agriculture. The second dimension of vulnerability is the glaciers. You saw some of it in this film. There are 10,000 odd Himalayan glaciers, and most of the glaciers which have been tracked through satellite, most of the glaciers, an overwhelming majority of the glaciers are under retreat. Some glaciers are advancing. The Siachen Glacier is a good example. Some glaciers are retreating but at a decelerating rate. The Gangotri Glacier is an example of this. But the bulk of the 10,000 glaciers are under retreat. And what this means to snow melt, what this means to the water flow of the North Indian rivers, you can well imagine. Not many countries in the world are dependent on water security for snow melt on glaciers as India is. The third dimension of vulnerability, you have a 7,500 kilometer long coastline. You have almost 250 million people living along the coastline, vulnerable to increase in mean sea levels. And if there is one scientific fact that has been conclusively established by climate change scientists, is that mean sea levels are bound to increase, have increased and will continue to increase. So you have Bangladesh's population, which is vulnerable to increase in mean sea level, is about 10 million. Maldives' population vulnerable to increase in mean sea level is 300,000. India's population vulnerable to increase in mean sea levels is around 200 million. Not many countries have that depth of vulnerability as India has. And the fourth and final dimension of vulnerability is the fact that most of our natural resources, coal, iron ore, uranium, bauxite, which is required to fuel economic growth, is located in forest areas. And therefore, the more resources you extract, the more areas of natural forests you will destroy, adding to the problem of global warming, and with a double whammy of using that coal to generate more CO2 into the atmosphere. So my friends, please take home this message that India is not a major emitter. India will be a major emitter. But the reason why the maximum stake in a successful outcome in Paris is with India is because, not because of our contribution to global warming, but because of the impact of global warming on us. No country, not China, not the United States, not any East Asian country, not any African country, has these four dimensions of vulnerability: monsoon, glaciers, increase in mean sea levels, and the destruction of forests, because of their link with the extraction of natural resources. So it really, India must be out there demanding an international agreement which would not produce instant miracles, because clearly that's not on the cards, but at least create the conditions in which people begin to look at options which will reduce the concentration of CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, and hydrofluorocarbons as well. Now, this hydrofluorocarbons is a peculiar animal, and I want to spend 2 minutes on this. Many of you are scientists. 20 years ago, nobody talked about climate change. Everybody talked about ozone depletion. That was the biggest environmental problem that the world faced: ozone depletion. Why was the ozone layer being depleted? The ozone layer was being depleted, we were told, scientists told us. Molina got the Nobel Prize in chemistry in 1995 for his work on this, that the hydrofluorocarbons, HCFC, which comes out of our refrigerators and air conditioners, is singularly responsible for depleting the ozone layer. So what did the world community do? The world community said, let's have an international agreement. So we had a Montreal Protocol. And the Montreal Protocol, which is the most successful international environmental agreement there is, mandated all countries to substitute hydrochlorofluorocarbons by hydrofluorocarbons. HCFCs would be substituted by HFCs. And guess what? Most countries have done it, including India. But now here comes the sting in the tail. HFC, which stops the ozone depletion, has 1,000 times the global warming potential as CO2. So what was a solution for the depletion of ozone layer has become a problem from the point of view of global warming. And now, one of the big debates in the international environmental community is how do you phase out, after having phased out HCFCs with HFCs, how do you phase out the HFCs? There's a big environmental issue. And out of this 2 degrees Celsius that I mentioned to you, control of the HFC alone could contribute about half a degree Celsius. So it's a very substantial 25 to 30% of the problem gets resolved if you are able to control or phase down the emissions of hydrofluorocarbons. The point I want to make is that these are extraordinarily complex issues, scientific issues. Many of these issues will continue to get debated. But based on the precautionary principle, which is the only principle that should guide decisions on environmental issues, we have to take preventive action. We have to take anticipatory action. We have to take proactive action. And that is why I think India needs to really put its head together and ask itself the basic question: how do I generate 8% economic growth consistent with protection of the environment, consistent with sustainable development practices, and consistent with international obligations that we may be called upon to take as part of an international agreement. Now, there are many environmentalists, I'm sorry to say, who will laugh at the 8% economic growth trajectory. And I want to tell you that you would be doing a gross disservice to the environmental cause if you reject the notion that India does not need faster economic growth. India needs faster economic growth. We cannot afford to grow at 4%. We cannot afford to grow at 5%. Simple, because these are compound rates of growth. Economy growing at 7% per year doubles in 10 years. An economy growing at 5% per year doubles in 14 years. And then as you go along, the time gap keeps increasing. So economic growth is of paramount importance. And why is it of paramount importance? This also you should understand. Economic growth is of paramount importance because there is no country in the world, which is going to add 1/3 of its current population in the next 30 years. Our demographic karma is that by the year 2050, we will be 1.7 billion people. Most countries in the world are seeing declining populations. They don't have to bother about future generations because there are hardly any future generation left. But for us, if there's one country that has to bother about future generations, that has to bother about intergenerational equity, which is a very important dimension of environmental decision making and economic calculus, it is India. Because we are going to be adding, all said and done, if all of you were to remain celibate for the rest of your lives, we would still be 1.7 billion by the year 2050 because of the sheer momentum and the bulge that we have created for ourselves over the last 60 years. So 400 million people joining the labor force in the next 30 years means you have to create jobs for 10 million people on an average, year after year after year. And there's one more peculiarity about the Indian demographic situation. Most countries are seeing declining populations and aging populations. India is seeing increasing populations and an increasingly younger population. The median age in India today is 27. And the median age in India is continued going to remain between 27 and 30 for the next 25 to 30 years. So we're going to have an expanding population, ever-expanding population. We're going to have an ever-expanding young population, which is going to have new set of aspirations, expectations, consumption, and therefore economic growth becomes all the more important. But how do you create this economic growth while maintaining the integrity of your environmental resources, your natural resources? How do you create energy demand for this population without necessarily adding to the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere? These are very serious questions. These are political issues. These are economic issues. These are not, I must tell you, these are not environmental issues alone. These are fundamentally issues of political economy. No government which is elected democratically in India will get re-elected if it were to say that I am not for expanding consumption, I am not for expanding economic growth, I am not for expanding living standards, I am not for improving the quality of life. All governments promise that and try to the best of their ability to deliver on that. But the new challenge for us is the climate challenge. And I think no longer can India be, my friend Karthik is here somewhere, the turtle man. Oh, there you are. Well, you know, India is a giant turtle. When we go out, we retreat into the shell, you know, right? When we start negotiating, we retreat. Kurmo angani va sarvashaha. We get into the kurma gets into its gigantic shell for protection. That is no longer there. Because the entire world today is watching India and what India does. And what India does is going to be absolutely crucial, not just for the world, but for itself. So, how do we, the key question which I want to leave with you, how do we become an exception to the traditional grow now, pay later model? Economics has taught us only one growth model, which is grow now, pay later. Have 25 years of high growth and worry about the consequences of that growth 25 years from now. Clean up your rivers 25 years from now. Clean up your air 25 years from now. Clean up your water 25 years from now. That grow now, pay later model, which the US pioneered, which is taken over by China, Brazil, other countries, that model is no longer sustainable internationally because of the climate change, and is no longer sustainable domestically because of the public health and other issues that are becoming evident. So my friends, we are in a tight corner, and I think science, and young scientists particularly, like you, who are embarking on your intellectual life, intellectual career, have a special responsibility to provide the trade-offs. Because these are trade-offs that have to be made. There are no simple solutions. There are choices that will be made, trade-offs that will have to be made, costs and benefits will have to be evaluated. At the two guideposts. Guidepost number one, does it help in sustaining high economic growth? And guidepost number two, simultaneously, not sequentially, but simultaneously, does it lead to sustainable development? Does it protect natural resources? Does it advance the cause of climate change? Does it improve the resilience, the word that was used in this film, does it improve the resilience of local communities to climate change? I think those are the real questions that will become very, very important. So growth has to be rapid and inclusive, but growth has also to be sustainable. So it's rapid, inclusive, and sustainable growth that we'll have to find, and I'm sure that many of you will devote the next couple of years of your professional careers to working on some of the issues that I have outlined today. Thank you very much.
I'm Mr. Akash Sharma from Delhi University. I just got to know recent news today that Rupert Murdoch just bought National Geographic Channel, and he's a staunch anti-climate change believer. How will it impact India as a country?
Well, you know, there are a lot of evangelists out there. Rupert Murdoch is one of the evangelists. Al Gore is another evangelist. What I have tried to tell you that there is no place for climate evangelism. You have to be hard-nosed realpolitik here. India cannot afford to do without coal. I mean, it's a blasphemous statement for a former environment minister to say, but fact is that India cannot afford to do without coal. Now, Mr. Rupert Murdoch will not like it, but he has to lump it, because India is cannot abandon its dependence on coal. Now, what India should be doing really is to seeing how its future trajectory of coal consumption is going to be, what substitution possibilities exist, are there cleaner ways of utilizing the coal. So those are the issues that we will have to come to grips with. But yeah, there is an international, climate change is now the in thing. And Mr. Modi is going to New York very shortly, in the next 3 weeks. And there will be usual music concerts, and Leonardo DiCaprio and all these guys will be around. And it's a big thing. I mean, it's supposed to be the signature event of 2015. But I think when you come down to reality, is somewhat different from the rhetoric. The rhetoric is, yeah, climate change, great moral issue of our times, we must do something. But it's when countries like India are forced to take decisions that some of these trade-offs become apparent.
If you could tell us a bit about your journey from an agnostic to a believer. And my second question is, what would be your favorite INDC if you were to make one today for us? Thank you.
Well, India's INDC, there is no great mystery what India's nationally determined contribution is going to be. Its first commitment, I prefer to use the word commitment than INDC. So first commitment is going to be that we will increase our we will reduce our emissions intensity. At Copenhagen, we pledged to reduce our emissions intensity. Emissions intensity, by the way, is emissions divided by GDP. So our emissions will go up, but emissions per unit of GDP will come down. In other words, for $1 of GDP, you will require less emissions. And for 1 ton of carbon dioxide, you will produce more GDP. So emissions intensity will come down by 35% by the year 2030. So that's one INDC. The second INDC will be that India will have massive expansion in solar energy. Right now our total solar capacity is 3 gigawatts, and Mr. Modi has already announced that this 3 gigawatts will go to 100 gigawatts by the year 2022. Now, whether it happens or not is a separate issue. Don't get involved in such minor details. The real issue is the headline issue. So the headline issue is we're going to go from 3 gigawatts now to 100 gigawatts of solar. 100 gigawatts of solar by the year 2022. So that's the second INDC. The third INDC would be that we will improve our energy efficiency, our cars, our trains, our fans, our air conditioners, our lighting, everything that consumes energy, we will improve our energy efficiency by 20-25%. This will be the 3 core INDCs. But the 2 INDCs that the world is looking for, which environmentalists are looking for, which you are looking for, is not going to happen. Neha. The first one, is India about to put a cap on consumption of coal? The answer is NO, no. Is India about to announce a peaking year? Very important, peaking year. China has announced a peaking year. It's announced that by 2026, emissions will peak and then it will start coming down. India will not announce a peaking year. India, will bide its time. Maybe 10 years from now we'll announce a peaking year. I have a very simple rule for peaking year. China plus 25, So whatever the Chinese do, you add 25 and that will be India's peaking year. It works everywhere, So it's a general rule. But those 3 INDCs, emissions intensity to come down further, solar energy to expand exponentially, astronomically, gargantuanly, humongously, 3 gigawatts to 100 gigawatts in the next 7 years. And third, the increase in energy efficiency. I think those INDCs India will announce. India may also announce that area under forests might go up from 23% right now to 33% by the year 2030. An objective that it has been saying since from 1952 onwards, So they'll repeat that this mantra that 1/3 of India should be under forests. Forests, by the way, are very important from a global warming point of view. Forests, Indian forests, about 70 million hectares of forests we have, and about 40% good forest area, 60% degraded, medium density forest area. This total forest area of 70 million hectares is absorbing close to 9% of our annual greenhouse gas emissions. Very important. It's a sink. It's a very important carbon, it's a natural carbon sink which India has. And remember, another thing that we often forget, India is a net reforester. You know, we are all worried about deforestation in this country, but the fact of the matter is, when you compare India with Brazil, which loses 2.5 million hectares of forest land every year, or Indonesia, or Papua New Guinea, or Congo, India is one of the few countries which is actually adding to green cover. Now, it may not be natural forest. You know, this green cover could be eucalyptus trees on highways also. So, but we are adding to green cover. So, we are a net reforester. That's an important INDC. And I think, you know, India might announce. But the first three are for sure that India will announce. The biggest thing will be solar. And that would be the badge of honor as far as India is concerned. And actually, come to think of it, there's no reason why India should not be the world leader in solar energy. The country that has no business being a world leader in solar energy, can you take a guess? Which country? Germany. It has no business being a leader in solar energy. 6 months there is no sun. It has no comparative advantage in solar energy. It has 37 gigawatts of solar power. And there are 6 million Germans today, 6 million Germans in a population of 80 million, almost 8%. 8% of Germany's population are energy producers. What Germany has done to renewable is they're bringing the mobile telephony revolution there, making everybody an energy producer. The net result is that Germany has 37 gigawatts of solar power and India has 3 gigawatts of solar power, whereas we should be actually out there. So that, I think, is going to be the most important contribution of India globally.
But I wanted to know that, has there been a shift, and will there be a shift? Do you know what is going to happen in the Paris meeting? Is India's position going to change drastically? And will they take your advice?
No. There's no danger, there's no threat, there is no probability of their taking my advice. In fact, when I was the minister, I had to overrule my own negotiators and I had to pull rank on them in order to get some of the things that I was able to get in Copenhagen and Cancun. You know, sometimes irrationality can cross all political boundaries. And climate change is one issue in which all governments have been irrational in their approach, dogmatic in their approach. And why? Because it goes back to this theory that I told you, which is that we did not cause the problem. That is the West that has caused the problem. So you clean up. And if you want us to clean up, give us the money, and give us your technology and we'll do it. But that has not led us anywhere. And in the process, what has happened is, India has become vulnerable to the climate change issue. And nobody is going to bail India out today. You'll have to generate the resources on your own. So I'm afraid India's stand in Paris, there's a delightful book that has just come out by Cambridge University Press. It's by Jayant Narlikar. Some of you must have heard of Jayant Narlikar, the great Indian astronomer. His daughter and his wife, the Narlikar, Amita Narlikar and another Narlikar, mother and daughter. They've written a book on understanding India's rise in global negotiations. It's a very interesting, fascinating book. They look at international trade, they look at nuclear negotiations and climate change negotiations. And they discover that the root of India's negotiating strategy lies in the Mahabharata. So they actually trace India's negotiating stance to the Mahabharata and to Yudhishthira in particular. Not Krishna, who was a very pragmatist guy, who could tell Arjuna, kill this guy now or kill that guy. Yudhishthira was supposed to be the upholder of dharma. And how India's negotiations have always been a morality play, not a play in pragmatism, not a play in constructive deal making. I do something, what will you do? That's not India's way of negotiating. India's way of negotiating has always been morality. You polluted, you pay. We will pollute, we will pay 25 years from now. But that's the morality argument. There's a justice argument. Also, Yudhishthira talked about justice. The justice argument is what I told you, that we are 1.25 billion, 12 million every year. Everybody has a right to carbon space. So that's a justice argument. So, it's India's not internationally, and the other thing about India is that nobody in the world can speak English as well as Indians do. And all negotiations take place in English. And the remarkable ability to use the English language to obfuscate reality with square brackets, round brackets, footnotes. You look at the text of the Paris Agreement that's doing the rounds on the internet, and much of it is Indian contributions. So it's not oriented towards solving a problem. The Americans and the Chinese did a bilateral deal, last November. Many of you may be aware that when Obama went to Beijing, the US and China did a bilateral deal, and the Chinese shifted their position. In Copenhagen, the Chinese minister and I stood together. But by 2014, I was out of power and the Chinese minister was still there, but he changed his position. He accepted that China will peak its coal consumption, which they never did in Copenhagen. He accepted that Chinese emissions will plateau. They never accepted in Copenhagen. So I think the answer to your question lies in, have you read Amartya Sen's Argumentative Indian? Well, that sums it up, It's not the deal-making Indian, it's the argumentative Indian.
Maybe this is more of a philosophical question, but I think conservation biologists are often seen as, or the environment is often seen as a cost, whereas when you talk about this 8% growth, what governments and in some sense politicians are looking for is something which gives income. So I'm just wondering whether you have any advice as to how we deal with this, because we're always a cost. Yeah. If the environment crashes, there's a cost.
It's a very important question you have raised. I didn't have time to get into this. The measurement of economic growth. What is the proper metrics of economic growth? It's a whole new field. And if you're interested in this, Partha Dasgupta, when I was the minister, I appointed an expert committee. I would be glad to share the report. Partha Dasgupta is a professor at Cambridge, a world leader, the guru of environmental economics, who has come up with a whole new way of measuring economic growth. By the way, environment is not just a cost. Environment can also give you a benefit, an ecosystem, the ecosystem benefits, right? By protecting water sources, by protecting forests, by protecting water bodies, you're getting benefits. So you're extracting coal, that's a cost, but regenerating a natural forest or protecting a water body by not building a dam, that's a benefit. So how do you value ecosystem costs and benefits? There are two approaches. One is what Pawan Sukhdev had done, and we had released a report for India on this. That also is available, it's available on the website. But the more important thing is what Partha Dasgupta had done, which he said that GDP measurement does not take into account deterioration in natural capital. In economics, anybody of economists here? Not many, thank God. In economics, you're taught GDP and NDP. So the GDP is gross and the NDP is net. But the net, it's net of obsolescence of physical capital, not natural capital. So what Partha Dasgupta has done really is come up with very powerful metrics on the valuation of economic growth, which takes into account environmental costs and benefits. And in fact, he has done some calculations for India as well. mention it in my book also. That's the way to go. If you can't measure, you can't model. If you can't model, you can't manage. So you've got to measure. You have to measure. Now, the problem is that there is a natural reluctance on the part of economists and finance ministers and economic advisors to take this concept, because if you're growing at 8% per year, chances are that if you value environmental costs, you will not be growing at 8% per year. You may be growing at, say, 5% per year, 5.5% per year. Now, then, there'll be economic times will say India has crashed, funeral, bad times are here, and so on and so forth. So it's this psychological fear that what environmental accounting will do to natural growth instincts. But more and more countries, Norway, Mexico, Costa Rica, more and more countries are doing this. We were supposed to start doing this by 2015, but I think that's been put off by a couple of years. But sooner rather than later, we will have to move to an accounting based on environmental costs and benefits. And if I may, with your permission, if I may make a personal remark, if you don't mind, your grandfather bequeathed to us the system of GDP accounting. All that we do, GDP accounting, is based on your grandfather's work. I hope the granddaughter will come up with a new system of GDP accounting which will account for environmental costs and benefits.
Yeah. So basically, I wanted to know how would the scenario be if this entire discussion, what you had, the entire talk was based on GDP and stuff. What would the scenario be, climate change scenario, if we started discussing this entire thing in terms of GNH, cross-national happiness, which Bhutan does?
Well, happiness. Bhutan is a very seductive example. It's very seductive. It's a population of 700,000. It's hermetic kingdom. It's not a boisterous democracy like ours. We should all be happy. I agree. We should all have gross national happiness. But what is happiness? Happiness is, most people in India today, if you were to ask what is happiness, if you ask a guy who's going on a bicycle, he will say happiness is buying a two-wheeler. If you guy asking a motorcycle, what is happiness? He'll say buying a Maruti. And if you ask a guy with a Maruti, he'll say buying a Honda. If you ask a person who doesn't have electricity at home, what's happiness? He or she will say getting electricity to my house. And the next thing you will know is fan. And the next thing you'll know is air conditioner. The point I'm trying to make to you is that it's all very well for Gandhi. The greatness of Gandhi was that he preached things that only he could follow. No ordinary human being could follow. We cannot run a democratic political system that preaches austerity. We cannot run a democratic political system that preaches denial. Sustainable consumption, yes. Why should you have 3 cars in your house? Why should you have inefficient air conditioners, right? Why should you keep lights running? Why shouldn't you recycle water? These are legitimate questions. But everybody wants consumption. Remember this. And the best example I can give you is China. Between 1992 and 2012, in 1992, China accounted for 11% of world greenhouse gas emissions. In 2012, it accounted for 26% of world greenhouse gas emissions. Between 1992 and 2012, China had 0 population growth. Population did not grow. So why did emissions increase? Consumption increased. People started wanting more electricity, more cars, right? But more processed foods. So I think you're living in an idealistic world. It's good to live in an idealistic world. It's good to have these ideals. But somewhere one has to get mugged by reality once in a while. And the reality is that inherent in all of us is a desire for consumption. So the big Gandhian question is sustainable consumption. Remember, Gandhi said once, very famously, there is enough in the world for everybody's need, but not enough for everybody's greed. I think that's a very nice way of putting sustainable consumption. So we should be looking at sustainability of consumption patterns. That is the only way we can increase gross national happiness. Otherwise, the Bhutanese way of increasing gross national happiness, unfortunately, is not workable in India. It works in Bhutan.
Apart from looking at issues about cutting down climate emissions, I see monitoring biodiversity in light of climate change as important as making decisions in places like Paris. And what one sees in India, and much of the people in this room would perhaps agree, is that doing ecological research in wildlife and protected areas on wildlife is getting more and more challenging and difficult. Funds are not an issue, but getting permits or facilitating international collaborations are becoming a challenge. And how important is to address this issue for India to become an example, apart from changing MOEF to climate change, adding climate change to it? Are we doing any policy interventions?
I think it's a very relevant question. The debate on climate change has forced other planetary boundary issues into the background. Because climate change has been so overpowering and so over-dominating the policy and academic landscape that the other planetary boundary issues that you have raised, the issue of biodiversity loss, the issue of ocean acidification, the issue of chemical contamination, the issue of traditional pollution, aerosols. You saw the burning of stoves and what it does to human health. The issue of aerosols and release of short-lived pollutants into the atmosphere. The issue of the nitrogen cycle and what it does to soil fertility. The issue of the phosphorus cycle, what it does to soil fertility. All these get relegated into the background because of this giant elephant in the room called climate change. And this happened to India, it happened to the world 25 years ago in public health. Today, who talks about TB? Who talks about malaria? Everybody talks about AIDS. So the AIDS became the giant elephant in the room, and it drove malaria research and tuberculosis research out of the window. And now people are now recognizing that there is a recrudescence of TB in our country, and it has devastating consequences, and is linked with AIDS as well. I think a time will come when people will begin to realize that climate change is only one of the planetary boundaries. There are 8 or 9 planetary boundaries that are being affected. Ozone depletion, another, but ozone depletion is a successful example where the international community could manage a resting point below the threshold level. But in other issues like ocean acidification, pollution, chemical contamination, biodiversity loss, we have already crossed planetary boundaries. So I do not disagree with you one bit that in our fixation on the climate change issue, because it's the dominant issue globally, India should not abdicate its responsibility for the traditional issues, particularly on biodiversity and management of ecosystems, and the issue that you raised on wildlife, for example, that I had to grapple with. These are issues that will continue to remain on the agenda. But let me also share with you that I'm not terribly optimistic, by the way, I'm not terribly optimistic that there is a determination today in the Indian decision-making system. And by decision-making system, I just don't mean politicians. I mean, politics, the dominant intellectual discourse in the media. I think there is economic triumphalism right now. And there is a tendency to look, as what Uma said, look at environment as a cost. Wildlife preservation is a cost. Why are we having 1,000 square kilometers for 9 dumb tigers? The 1,000 square kilometers can have 1,000 SEZs and create 10 million jobs. I mean, that mindset, I'm afraid, is the dominant mindset today. And what is happening to the loosening of environmental laws. The entire edifice of environmental regulation, the Environmental Protection Act, the Forest Conservation Act, the Water Pollution Act, the Air Pollution Act, the Wildlife Protection Act. I mean, I fought for 2.5 years to protect NH7, in Madhya Pradesh, because it was going to protect a tiger corridor. And today I find in the newspapers that now it's up for grabs. In the name of connectivity, in the name of providing national highways. So it's at times I think, I'm not asking you to give up. I don't think you should give up. I don't think you should take defeat for granted. But the odds are stacked. The odds are stacked. But when people's livelihoods get threatened, then people become your greatest supporters. I think one of the greatest disadvantages of conservation biology in this country, if I may say so, and ride a pet hobby horse of mine, which got me into serious trouble with the Ullas Karans and the Valmik Thapars of the world. They were united only in their opposition to me, otherwise they would always fight with each other. What united them was that I felt that conservation biologists were not strengthening local community stakes and participation in the protection of ecosystems. And those of you who have read conservation economics, Eleanor Ostrom, who got the Nobel Prize in economics, she was not an economist, the only non-economist to get a Nobel Prize for economics, for her work on managing the commons. This is all commons. These are all commons that we are talking about. Regional commons, local commons, global commons. And what she said was that the traditional literature has only two models: the state-centered model and the private entrepreneur-driven model. And in between, from her work in Nepal and Sikkim and the eastern Himalayas, she showed that the most successful interventions were community-driven models and not necessarily state-driven or private-driven. So I think to the extent that scientists are able to create champions in environmental conservation and sustainable development in local communities, you will be more successful. If more and more of conservation is seen to be a top-down approach, then people are going to react differently. And my own experience, whether it was in Vedanta, whether it was on POSCO, whether it was in Uttarakhand, my own experience is that when local communities see livelihoods being threatened, they are prepared to confront the state and demand their rights over natural resources. After all, what was the Chipko movement all about? It was not a state-driven movement, it was a purely community-driven movement to protect forests in the Himalayas.
Lovely talk, sir. My name is Kalyan, I'm a wildlife filmmaker. In India today, there's a conflict between what you rightly said, livelihood, environment protection, and of course the GDP, economic growth. And the debate today has obviously been environment is the main reason which is holding back India's economic development, which unfortunately started by your government before BJP. So how can we change that debate? I mean, we all know that that's not a leveling, I mean, it's not a playing field to have an equal debate, but these can go hand in hand, livelihood, environment, and aspirations of India. What do you think, how can that debate, the questions of that debate can change for India?
Well, I think the way to take the debate forward is to recognize that choices have to be made. The choices should be made in an explicit, transparent manner. Trade-offs should be made very clear. And the conflicts that are generated as part of the trade-offs get managed through the democratic process. It's not enough to say that environment and development should go hand in hand. That's a 101 statement, right? I mean, who can disagree with a statement that environment and development should go hand in hand? Obviously, they should go hand in hand. It's the question of what happens and how do you manage the consequences. And sometimes you will have to take choices. You will have to make those choices, and those choices have to be made consciously. And those choices are better made based on informed decision making, sometimes based on science, sometimes based on the perceptions of local communities. So there is no magic template for this environment development debate, okay? I mean, it's a debate, I mean, it's a conflict. There is a conflict, let's understand this. To think that there is no conflict, I think we are living in a fool's paradise. There are tough choices to be made. Now, how do you make those choices? Sometimes technology will give you the option to make those choices. In 2010, a very leading Indian private company applied for setting up a power plant. And I found when I joined the Ministry of Environment and Forests that they had got an environmental clearance for setting up a 1,000 megawatt power plant which would destroy the mango orchards of Ratnagiri district. And one of the reasons, the scientists told me, was that they were using high sulfur coal. Because they were, that was the coal contract that they had. So the natural question that I asked was, if they're using high sulfur coal, why all over the world you use flue gas desulfurizers? Why aren't we making it compulsory for this plant to use the FGDs, the flue gas desulfurizers? They said, sir, we didn't make it part of the condition. So we redid the environmental clearance. We made, because already a lot of work had been done, and we made sure that the company actually invested in a new technology which would reduce the sulfur emissions and the damage on the mango orchards. And we created a local system of monitoring to ensure that the emissions were within the prescribed limits. Now, that's an example in which you allowed something to go forward with the help of new technology. But there may be occasions where the environment growth debate forces you to take a stand saying, no, I would rather not have growth, but I would protect the environment because it is in the long-term interests of the country. And I'll give you a classic example of this. There were 3 dams. You saw dams being discussed in the film. There were 3 large dams being planned on the river Bhagirathi in the upper reaches of the Ganga between Gomukh and Uttarkashi, 120 kilometers stretch. This would have completely denuded the Ganga upper reaches of any water. 2 of these power plants, 40% of the work had been done, had been completed. NTPC had spent 2,000 crores. And we were faced with the prospect of what should we do? So what we did was we just abandoned this project. You can go today at Lohari Nagpala and see that NTPC project is a museum piece. It was done 40%, 800 crores had been spent, but the government of the day decided that in the long-term ecological interests of the river and of the ecosystem, this project, which would never have got the clearance in the first place, will now be abandoned. Now that's an example of a situation where you didn't allow a certain symbol of economic growth. You actually stopped a dam from being constructed. What was Silent Valley all about? Silent Valley, 35 years ago, was protected on the grounds that in the long-term ecological interests of Kerala and the Western Ghats, we should not have a hydel project in Silent Valley. So I think, the point is that these choices have to get made. And sometimes the choice would be in favor of the growth constituency, and sometimes the choice will have to be in favor of those who are wanting to protect the environment as it is and not have any interventions which would exacerbate the stress on the environment.
I guess most ecologists and environmentalists here would not protest against dams or roads in the Himalayas if we could actually build, a road that got somewhere or a dam that worked in a sense. So we also, when it comes to using solar, to harnessing solar, I think the biggest limitation we have in India today is the mess that our national grid is in. Or the national grid, or the way we share energy around this country. Or when it comes to ensuring that our forests remain carbon sinks, we need to really think quick, smart, and address these challenges. But I don't know whether we'll ever get efficient or whether we'll ever get smart enough to integrate the science that we have produced in this very own institute or elsewhere to address these challenges. We somehow seem to just fall behind every day, keep going backwards than moving forwards on most of these challenges. So how?
Well, I think efficiency improvements are a very important aspect of our growth strategy. But please don't get carried away by the romanticism of efficiency, because the population pressure being what it is in India, the demographic situation being what it is in India, that's the fundamental reality, that you need more power, you need more roads, you need more, industrial factories, you need more highways, you need more rail lines. The question really is that now there's a big, debate on the Hubli-Ankola rail line going through the Western Ghats. The last 15 years has been being discussed. That's an example of a debate that has taken place which has actually favored protection of the environment. So there are examples where, because of sustained civil society pressure, because of sustained pressure from the scientific community, from the larger political community, these choices have got made. But the basic point remains that, yes, by all means, let's have an efficient national grid, let's have efficiency improvements. But bottom line is, because of our demographic pressure, you have to generate more power. You have to build more roads, you have to build new cities, you have to create new infrastructure, which is going to extract some toll or the other on the environment. You cannot eliminate the toll on the environment, by the way. You cannot completely eliminate it. What you can do is to take interventions, precautions. The best precaution is not to do it, but that, I'm afraid, is not a situation that will be acceptable in all cases.